We arrived in the new city late in the evening. Winter lights reflected off the windshield, creating a cozy yet expectant atmosphere. Jason's business trip coincided with Colin's important interview, and I had suggested we all go together. Still, something about the prospect of sharing such close quarters for a few days made me uneasy. The apartment we rented was much smaller than it looked in the photos. Modest furniture, dim lighting, and just one single bed. I glanced at Jason, waiting for his reaction, but he simply shrugged as if it didn't matter. Colin gave a reserved smile and nodded. "We'll make it work," he said. I forced a smile in return, suppressing a wave of discomfort. A thought flitted through my mind. How will we manage this? While Jason unpacked his things, Colin helped me. His hands brushed against mine a few times, brief accidental touches, but they felt sharper than they should have. Maybe I was just tired from the trip. We gathered for a dinner pieced together from the nearby store's meager offerings. Jason talked about his plans for tomorrow, his voice calm and steady as always. But I found myself more preoccupied with Colin. He rarely chimed in but occasionally cast brief glances in my direction. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to his nerves about the interview. Later that evening, when we finally settled in, an odd discomfort crept over me. Jason took the far side of the bed first. I lay down next to him, and Colin took the other side. The mattress dipped under us, every breath and movement amplified. The closeness seemed to expose all my senses. I tried to fall asleep, but my thoughts were tangled. Colin's touches, his glances, they made me feel something I couldn't quite name. I told myself it was just the strain of the journey, but deep down I knew it wasn't that simple. Between my husband and foster son, I suddenly felt crowded. Not just physically, but emotionally. This situation was turning out to be unexpectedly complicated. By morning, the city revealed itself in all its austere winter charm. Frost-covered buildings, a dense morning mist, and the occasional passerby hurrying along. We left the apartment early to make it to Colin's interview. He seemed composed and confident, yet I noticed his occasional glances toward me as though seeking approval or support. Our route took us through several blocks, and as we walked, Colin touched me more than once. First, he handed me my scarf, then steadied me by the elbow when I slipped on the icy sidewalk. His touches were innocent, fleeting, but they stirred a warmth in me I wasn't expecting. "Over there, straight ahead," he said, lightly brushing my shoulder. I nodded, trying not to show my unease. It was a small thing, really, but there was a strange sense of connection in these gestures, as though they carried more meaning than necessity. Jason walked a few steps ahead the entire time, glued to his phone. He spoke only occasionally, and even then it was about work, completely oblivious to either me or Colin. I looked at my husband and couldn't help feeling an emptiness. Our relationship had always been steady, but it was now clear that this stability no longer brought me joy. His attention had long lacked tenderness, those small signs of care I once cherished. When we reached the building for the interview, a strange tension settled over me. Jason and I waited at a nearby cafe while Colin left. Jason delved into his work, raising his head only sporadically to make brief, disconnected remarks. I missed his attention, and this absence felt especially stark now, with all three of us together. Colin returned an hour later, glowing with satisfaction. "It went great," he said, sliding into a chair. His smile was infectious, and I couldn't help but laugh lightly. We strolled a bit longer, wandering into souvenir shops and admiring window displays. Colin continued to find moments for fleeting touches, handing me a bag or steadying my hand. They were subtle, almost imperceptible, but I felt a shift inside me. By evening, we were back at the apartment. Jason buried himself in his laptop again, not even glancing my way. Exhausted, I sat on the couch and stared out the window, while Colin sat beside me. His presence seemed to fill the void I had been feeling so acutely. "Tired?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. He nodded, giving me a slight smile that made me uneasy. Inside, I felt something stirring, something I didn't know how to confront. The long day had finally ended. We returned to the apartment exhausted, relief washing over us. Colin's interview was behind him, and for a moment we could relax. Jason was the first to suggest unpacking. but as soon as he touched the bed, he yawned deeply and said, "I'm too tired to deal with anything right now." I smiled, moving his things aside, but my gaze once again landed on the bed. What had seemed small during the day now looked undeniably insufficient. I tried to suppress the awkwardness, but the thought of 3 adults sharing one mattress lingered. As we settled in, the tightness of the space became undeniable. Jason claimed the far side, I positioned myself in the middle, and Colin lay down on the other edge, carefully keeping to his side to give me more room. The mattress sagged slightly beneath our combined weight, and everything suddenly felt so close. The breathing, the movements, even the faint scents became sharply noticeable. The first touch was accidental. Jason's arm draped over me as he fell asleep, and I instinctively pressed closer to his warm side. But then, just moments later, I felt a light touch from the other side. Colin's hand brushed against my thigh. I froze. My heart began to race, but I quickly told myself it was just an accident. After all, the space really was cramped. Colin must have shifted in his sleep. I closed my eyes, willing myself to sleep, but my body remained tense. The mattress dipped again, and I felt Colin inch closer. His knee barely grazed mine. It was fleeting, but felt like it lingered longer than it should have. I tried to adjust my position to create more space between us, only to face another problem. Jason's arm slid off my shoulder, and his warm body pressed closer to mine. Caught between the 2 men, I felt trapped, not just physically but emotionally. As the silence of the night deepened, I realized Jason was already fast asleep. His breathing had become steady, his arm limp around my waist. But then I felt another touch, this time more deliberate. Colin's hand lightly brushed against my hip. The gesture was so subtle it could have been dismissed as accidental, but my entire body tensed. I froze, trying to decipher what was happening. At first I thought he might have been asleep too, but then his fingers pressed slightly, and the touch became unmistakable. My heart pounded so loudly I was certain it would wake the whole apartment. This can't be real, I thought, trying to convince myself it was nothing. I carefully moved his hand away, not wanting to wake Jason, but everything inside me screamed. I turned slightly, trying to put some distance between us, but Colin shifted closer again. His hand now rested on my waist, and his breath felt closer. That was when I realized he wasn't asleep. My body froze, but my mind was in turmoil. His touches were insistent but not forceful. They were warm, stirring a storm of conflicting emotions inside me. "What are you doing? Why aren't you stopping this?" my inner voice screamed. But the answer was simple. I couldn't. My body was responding with a force that scared me. I felt his fingers trail lower, and I quickly turned to push his hand away. At that moment, Jason shifted in his sleep, and I froze, fearing he would wake up. Colin froze too. His hand withdrew, but I could still feel the warmth of his touch. I closed my eyes, trying to convince myself it was all accidental, but my heart was pounding too loudly and my breathing remained uneven. That night left me with more than just confusion. It was the beginning of something I couldn't understand, yet something I couldn't stop. I woke up to the first rays of sunlight peeking through the heavy curtains. The air in the room was dense, filled with the lingering stillness of sleep. Jason was still fast asleep, his body unmoving, his breathing steady. Colin, however, was already awake. He stood by the window, leaning against the sill, looking calm as if nothing had happened. "How did you sleep?" His voice was steady, almost indifferent. I froze for a moment, trying to decipher the meaning behind his question. Memories of the night resurfaced vividly, tightening a knot in my chest. "Well," I replied shortly, avoiding his gaze. He smiled faintly, nodded, and turned back to the window. His composure was unsettling. It wasn't the reaction I had expected, no guilt, no attempt to explain himself. A sense of unease crept into my thoughts. We went about our morning routine as if everything was normal. Jason eventually woke up, muttering something about breakfast, and disappeared into the bathroom. I stood at the stove, feeling Colin's gaze on me from across the table. He watched me in silence, his presence louder than any words. All day I tried to push the memories of the night out of my mind, but they kept returning. Every touch from Colin, every moment of closeness now seemed more significant than ever. My body, as if acting on its own, responded to his presence. Jason and I stepped out to the store, leaving Colin at home. On the way, Jason talked about his work and plans for the next day, none of which involved me. I tried to focus on his words, but my thoughts kept pulling me back to the night. His voice was a distant hum, while I felt the growing emptiness between us. That evening, when we returned, the tension resurfaced. Colin remained as composed as ever, his movements fluid, his voice steady. It seemed as though the night had been nothing more than a passing episode for him. But for me, it was different. I found myself lost in my thoughts. Colin's glances, his touches, they continued to stir something in me. At one point, I realized I was looking for excuses to talk to him or linger in his presence. Jason, absorbed in his phone, didn't notice how long I had been watching Colin. Later, Colin came to grab a cup from the table, brushing my hand lightly in the process. It was accidental, but the touch froze me, as if for a split second, he had read my thoughts. "Are you okay?" he suddenly asked, tilting his head slightly. "Yes, of course," I replied, turning away. In truth, everything was far from okay. I couldn't understand what was happening to me. My inner conflict was overwhelming. I felt increasingly distant from Jason, but that frightened me as much as the strange pull I felt toward Colin. I was desperate for answers but found only more questions. The city greeted us with crisp air and bright sunshine. Armed with a map, Jason confidently suggested a stroll through the center to visit shops and landmarks. It was a rare day when the three of us could spend time together without rushing or thinking about obligations. I hoped it would help me clear my mind, but the tension from the previous night still lingered. Colin walked beside me, his movements confident, his gaze focused. At first glance, he seemed ordinary, relaxed, but I felt something new in his presence. Every time he came close, my skin seemed to ignite. "Look, there's a souvenir shop over there," he said, lightly touching my elbow. I flinched at the simple gesture, and my body responded again to his touch. I could no longer dismiss this as accidental. I felt he was doing it intentionally, though his face betrayed no emotion. In the shop, I tried to focus on trinkets, glass ornaments, small figurines, postcards. But Colin was nearby, handing me something from the shelf. His hand lingered on mine slightly longer than necessary. My breathing quickened, and I immediately averted my eyes, as though trying to escape from whatever was beginning to spark between us. Jason, meanwhile, kept his distance, engrossed in a phone conversation. His voice faded into the background as if he wasn't even there. I realized I no longer expected his attention. We continued our walk, stopping at a cafe where I ordered coffee, deliberately avoiding looking in Colin's direction. But sensing my unease, he sat beside me, his knee brushing against mine. The contact was fleeting, but it made my heart race. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. "Yes, just thinking." I tried to smile, but my voice sounded strained. His gaze was steady as though he knew something but chose not to say it. Between us hung a tension filled with unspoken words neither of us dared utter. On the way back to the apartment, I felt a slight relief. The day was coming to an end, and perhaps I could calm the storm of emotions raging inside me. But as soon as we walked in, the tension returned, stronger than before. Jason immediately disappeared into his laptop, muttering something about urgent work. I stayed in the room, picking up items I had accidentally dropped. Colin was beside me faster than I expected. "Let me help," he said calmly, his hands moving over the items as though every little thing mattered. When our fingers touched, a wave of warmth surged through my body. I froze, looking up at him. His eyes were serious but calm. We both paused for a moment, as if the world around us had stopped. "Thank you," I whispered, stepping back. Colin said nothing, simply nodding lightly. But that moment lingered with me. I felt the inner conflict grow stronger. My emotions were like a burning ball I couldn't hold, and each passing day I lost more control over myself. The room was thick with tension. As always, Jason had fallen asleep first, his steady breathing filling the space. I lay still, but inside everything was churning. Colin was near. His presence felt palpable, as if the air between us had grown heavier. I heard him move, careful not to disturb Jason. His steps were soft, but each one echoed in my mind. Colin sat on the edge of the bed, and I felt the mattress dip slightly under his weight. My heart pounded faster. I closed my eyes, pretending to be asleep, but my breathing betrayed me. It was too shallow, too quick. I could feel his gaze on me, but I didn't dare open my eyes. Silence hung between us, thick with something invisible yet undeniable. He sat there for minutes that felt like hours. I couldn't predict what would happen next, but the atmosphere was shifting. His presence pulled me in, like the very energy of the room was changing. When I finally dared to turn my head slightly, our eyes met. In the darkness, his gaze was deep and piercing, and I couldn't look away. Colin reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against mine. It wasn't just a touch. It was a question, a silent plea for an answer. "Colin," I whispered, but my voice was too soft, as if I wasn't stopping him but instead allowing him to continue. He moved closer and I felt the warmth of his breath on my skin. My mind screamed to stop this, but my body seemed to have a will of its own. Colin leaned in, and I knew I wouldn't resist. His lips touched mine softly at first, but it was enough to make the world around us vanish. It wasn't just a kiss. It was an explosion that I couldn't ignore. I kissed him back, forgetting everything. Jason, the past, the consequences. In that moment, there was only us. The kiss deepened, growing more passionate. His hand cupped my face, and my fingers instinctively gripped his shoulder. All the restraint between us melted away, replaced by a storm of emotions. I felt my body respond to him, my boundaries shattering. But suddenly, reality crashed over me like a cold wave. I pulled back abruptly, gasping for air as though I couldn't breathe. "What are we doing?" I whispered, staring at him. Colin didn't answer, only looked at me with the same piercing gaze that held everything: desire, regret, and confusion. I turned away sharply, trying to regain control. I lay back down, facing Jason, who was still fast asleep. But even lying beside my husband, I couldn't escape what had just happened. The kiss burned on my lips, and inside, everything was a chaotic mess. I felt fear, guilt, but above all, a thrill that wouldn't let me go. I knew I had crossed a line and there was no turning back. That night changed me. My heart raced louder than ever and my mind found no answers. I didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was clear. My life would never be the same again. The morning after the kiss was quiet, yet every second of it felt unbearably loud. I woke up before everyone else, careful not to make a sound. Jason was still asleep, his breathing deep and steady. Colin lay nearby, turned on his side. He seemed to be asleep too, but I could feel his presence just as sharply as I had the night before. My body still reacted to his closeness. Every memory of his lips on mine made my heart race. I tried to take a deep breath, but instead of relief, all I felt was mounting tension. "What am I doing?" ran through my mind. Guilt crashed over me in waves, mixing with a desire I couldn't suppress. I got up, avoiding his direction, and went to the bathroom, hoping to collect myself. But my reflection in the mirror offered no solace. Instead, it showed me a woman who no longer knew who she was or what she wanted. When everyone woke up, the tension didn't dissipate. Jason, as usual, buried himself in his phone, oblivious to my turmoil. Colin glanced at me fleetingly, but each look felt searing. I tried to keep my distance, but his presence filled the room no matter where I went. At breakfast, I could barely eat a bite. Each accidental glance exchanged with Colin left me shaken. He said nothing out of place, but his movements, his gaze, his tone, all seemed deliberately crafted to remind me of what had happened. In the afternoon, I suggested a walk, purely as an excuse to escape the apartment. Jason readily agreed, and Colin, as always, tagged along. I walked ahead, trying not to look back, but I could feel his gaze on my back. When we stopped in a park, I tried to relax, but nothing helped. Jason chatted about work while Colin stayed silent, his silence louder than any words. I kept catching myself thinking that every gesture he made seemed intentional, even if it wasn't. By evening, I felt utterly drained. As we headed back to the apartment, I prayed for just one moment of solitude. But there was no escaping this situation. Colin was there, and it drove me insane. When Jason finally fell asleep, I felt a brief sense of relief, but it was short-lived. Colin sat in the chair opposite me, silently watching. I pretended to read a book, but the letters danced on the page. My heart began to race again, and that familiar feeling rose inside me, a mixture of fear, guilt, and longing. I wanted to talk to him, to say that what had happened was a mistake, but every time I opened my mouth, the words got stuck deep inside. He seemed to understand and didn't try to speak. The tension inside me reached its peak. I didn't know how to handle this. My life with Jason now felt distant and hollow, but I couldn't understand how or why Colin had become something more than just my foster son. When I finally lay down in bed, my thoughts wouldn't let me rest. I desperately wanted to return to normalcy, to pretend nothing had happened, but it was impossible. My life no longer followed the rules I had once set. The memory of Colin's kiss refused to leave me. It felt as though that night had come alive inside me, embedding itself in my reality. Every movement he made, every glance, every accidental touch reminded me of how my body had responded to his. Even simple moments, him walking by or making casual remarks, were imbued with a strange significance. I tried to suppress it, but the internal conflict grew unbearable. Guilt toward Jason weighed on me like a heavy burden, yet my desire for Colin defied logic. I felt myself losing control, and it terrified me. In the morning, after another restless night, I ran into Jason in the kitchen. He looked his usual composed self, but his gaze lingered on me a moment longer than usual. "Everything okay?" he asked while pouring himself coffee. "Yeah, just tired," I replied, avoiding his eyes. But I knew my words sounded unconvincing. Jason didn't press the issue, but his silence suggested he sensed something was different. I tried to act normal, but my eyes betrayed me. My reflection in the mirror felt foreign, my gaze too troubled, my movements too jittery. I couldn't decide what was scarier, the possibility that Jason might figure it out, or the fact that I no longer knew what I wanted. The day dragged on painfully. I avoided Colin, trying not to be in the same room as him. But the more I tried to maintain distance, the more aware I became of his presence. It was almost a physical pull, as if there was an invisible connection between us that I couldn't resist. By evening, the tension reached its peak. Jason buried himself in work, leaving me alone with Colin in the living room. I sat on the couch, trying to focus on a book, but the pages were meaningless to me. Colin entered the room with his usual calm, but there was something more deliberate in his movements. He walked over to the bookshelf and pulled out a volume I knew he hadn't read before. "This might suit you," he said, handing me the book. I looked up to take it, and our hands brushed again. This time, the touch wasn't accidental. It lingered a fraction of a second longer than necessary. I felt something ignite inside me, as though that touch answered all my hidden questions. My heart raced. I quickly pulled my hand away, trying to maintain distance, but I already knew it was futile. "Thanks," I said, avoiding his gaze. Even through such a simple gesture, I could feel his attention. He was there, and it was impossible to ignore. I stood up, trying to put space between us, but his eyes followed me, holding me in place. My soul was torn between fear and desire. That night ended like the others. I lay in the dark, unable to find peace. Colin was in the next room, and it felt as though I could sense him even through the walls. The internal conflict consumed me, leaving me trapped between truth and desire. The evening was filled with silence, broken only by the gentle rustle of the wind. Jason, as usual, was glued to his computer, fully immersed in work. I sat nearby, feeling the tension in the room build. "Let's go for a walk?" Colin suggested. I hesitated but nodded. I needed to step outside, to escape the suffocating space of the apartment. The street greeted us with cool air and the dim glow of streetlights. We walked side by side, our footsteps forming a rhythmic melody. Colin walked closer than usual. His hand brushed my elbow a few times, guiding or stopping me before a turn. I didn't know how to react. My thoughts were foggy, but my body responded to every touch. "It's peaceful here," he said softly, stopping briefly. I nodded, avoiding his gaze, but I could feel his eyes on me. We continued walking, and the tension between us became almost tangible. Finally, we reached a bridge. Below us, the water shimmered, reflecting the sparse lights. Colin stopped and turned to face me, his eyes meeting mine. I felt everything inside me freeze. "You know, I've always been here," he began, "but now everything's different." I didn't know how to respond. His words were simple yet heavy with meaning. "You've become someone else to me," he added, stepping closer. "Colin," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I can't keep quiet anymore," he interrupted, his hand lightly brushing mine. That moment stretched into eternity. His face was so close I could feel the warmth of his breath. I tried to look away but couldn't. He leaned in and our lips met. It wasn't just a kiss. It was a confession I could no longer escape. I kissed him back, forgetting everything. Jason, fears, consequences. In that moment, there was only us. When the kiss ended, I stepped back, my heart pounding wildly. "You know everything will change now," he said softly, his eyes locked on mine. I couldn't answer, but I knew he was right. We had crossed a line and there was no turning back. The room was steeped in semi-darkness. As always, Jason fell asleep first, his breathing steady, almost lulling. But sleep wouldn't come to me. The tension in the air grew heavier with every passing moment. Colin sat at the edge of the bed, his silhouette barely visible in the dim glow of the bedside lamp. I could feel his presence as if he were inches away. I closed my eyes, willing myself to sleep, but my thoughts roamed. Colin's scent, the warmth of his body, his quiet breathing, all of it filled the room, reminding me of what I'd been missing for so long. My heart began to race. Colin leaned closer, his hand brushing my shoulder. It was a gentle, almost innocent touch, yet it sent a wave of emotion through me. I froze, unsure of what to say or do. "Are you cold?" he asked softly. His voice was calm, but there was something deeper in his question. I didn't respond, merely turning onto my side, trying to create more space between us. But the tension only grew. Suddenly, I felt him wrap his arm around me from behind. His movements were careful, deliberate yet not forceful. His warmth immediately filled the void I had been feeling for so long. "Colin," I whispered, but my voice was too weak to sound like protest. His hand slid to my waist, gently pulling me closer. My body responded before my mind could catch up. I couldn't resist anymore. It all happened so quickly, yet it felt as if time had slowed. His hands moved confidently, exploring my body, as if removing the final barriers between us. Our clothes disappeared so seamlessly I hardly noticed, and I realized I wasn't thinking about anything but him. Colin was there, closer than anyone had ever been. His touch was sensual, his warmth enveloping me, erasing all my doubts. I could no longer pretend this wasn't what I wanted. My hesitation vanished. We were so close now that there was no turning back. This moment became the culmination of all our emotions, all our desires. But suddenly, amidst the passion, I heard Jason stir. My mind snapped back to reality. "What?" Jason mumbled groggily as he shifted, reaching for the blanket. His gaze landed on us, and I froze, realizing there was no going back. His eyes widened in shock. He sat motionless, as if unable to believe what he was seeing. It all started with a faint movement. Jason stirred in bed, his face twitching in a half-asleep grimace. A second later, he sat up abruptly as if something had alarmed him. A wave of dread washed over me, but it was too late to move. His gaze fell on us, on me and Colin, too close to each other, on the blanket crumpled at the edge of the bed. Jason yanked it sharply, revealing what had been hidden. For a moment, the room was dead silent, broken only by our ragged breathing. "What's going on here?" His voice was loud, trembling with tension. I tried to say something, but the words caught in my throat. Colin was silent, his eyes fixed on a single point, as if he already knew there would be no excuses. "Catherine?" Jason continued, his voice growing harsher. "What are you doing?" It's not what you think," I finally said, but my voice was so uncertain that even I didn't believe the words. Jason got out of bed, his eyes darting between me and Colin. The tension in the room was almost unbearable. "I was just hot," I began, frantically searching for words. It's all a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" he repeated, his voice filled with bitter laughter. "You're saying this is normal?" I tried to stay calm, but his gaze burned through me. Colin stood nearby, his silence speaking louder than any words could. "Jason, you're misunderstanding everything," I continued. "Nothing happened. This is just a mistake." A mistake? His voice cracked. Do you think I'm an idiot? I felt the ground slipping from under me. His face showed not only anger but also disappointment, something I feared the most. I can't believe this, he said, turning to Colin, looking at him with disgust. You were supposed to be like a son to me. And this? Colin opened his mouth to speak, but Jason raised a hand to stop him. Don't say anything. I don't want to hear it. I looked at Jason, feeling everything collapse. His trust, our relationship, our life, it was all falling apart right before my eyes. This is the end, he finally said, his voice cold and definitive. I can't live with this. Jason, wait. I tried to stop him. No, he interrupted. You betrayed me. There's nothing left between us. He left the room, leaving me and Colin in a silence filled with the echo of his words. Colin slowly sat down, his face tense, but he said nothing. I felt my world crumbling. My heart raced in panic, and my mind refused to comprehend what to do next. I had lost my husband, destroyed my family, and now had no idea where to find solid ground. When Jason left, the door slammed shut with a deafening sound, leaving Colin and me in suffocating silence. The room felt empty, even though he was still there. His presence, which once filled everything around me, now hung in the air like a heavy weight. Jason never came back. His belongings disappeared a few days later, taken quietly without explanation. Divorce papers arrived almost immediately, as if he had long known that the end was inevitable. I read them, feeling everything inside me collapse, realizing in that moment that he would never forgive me. The apartment became empty. It reminded me of every mistake, every word I said to Jason in my desperate attempt to justify myself. Now those words felt foolish and meaningless. Colin stayed. His confidence unnerved me. He didn't seem to feel guilt, or at least he didn't show it. His gaze was calm, even cold, as if everything that had happened was simply a step forward. We did this together, he said once when I tried to start a conversation. But it destroyed everything, I replied, feeling tears burn in my eyes. You were never happy, he added, as if he knew more about me than I knew myself. I couldn't argue, but agreeing was too painful. His words felt like a truth I didn't want to accept. I often stayed alone in the bedroom where it all began. The room still held traces of our past, photos on the nightstand, a few trinkets Jason and I had bought early in our marriage. It all reminded me of what I could never get back. Colin tried to be there for me, but his presence only deepened my sense of loss. He wanted to talk about the future, but I couldn't imagine it. I was trapped between a past I had destroyed and a present I couldn't accept. Do you regret it? He asked one day. I don't know, I answered honestly. It was the truth. I didn't know how I felt. My life no longer belonged to me. It was shattered into pieces I didn't know how to put back together. At night, I woke up in an empty bed, feeling the weight of loneliness. Even when Colin was nearby, I felt distant. His touches, which once ignited warmth and excitement, now felt foreign. My future remained uncertain. Being with Colin felt wrong, yet I couldn't fully let him go. Staying in the apartment, surrounded by memories of Jason, was torment, but leaving wasn't an option either. I stared out the window, watching the seasons change. My life stood still, frozen in a moment of indecision that I couldn't resolve. The divorce papers arrived officially a few weeks later. Their cold formality tore at my soul. The words on the white page screamed that our family no longer existed. I read them over and over, unable to believe it was real. My days had become monotonous, getting up, making myself breakfast I couldn't finish, and sitting in silence. Jason had disappeared from my life, leaving behind only emptiness. I knew I had brought us to this end, but the realization didn't ease the pain. Colin stayed by my side, trying to offer support. He told me everything would be fine, that we could start anew. But his words carried more insistence than reassurance. You're not alone, he said, sitting beside me. I nodded, but deep down, I knew I couldn't accept his words. My heart was torn between guilt and disappointment. Every time Colin touched me, I felt conflicting emotions. His care felt too overbearing, his gestures too confident. I didn't know what I wanted, his support or for him to disappear from my life. You're thinking about him, he said one day. Yes, I replied honestly. Jason never left my mind. I thought about his reaction, about how his face twisted with pain when he saw Colin and me together. I saw his disappointment, and it haunted me, making me replay those moments over and over. My life with Colin no longer brought me the warmth I had sought. His presence had become a reminder that everything was broken. His attempts to be with me only deepened my guilt. Each evening, I sat in the bedroom that felt too big and cold. The sheets we had shared with Jason now felt foreign. I couldn't sleep, hearing only the sound of my thoughts. Colin was no longer the person I had seen at the beginning. His confidence began to scare me. I saw how he was changing, becoming more distant, more assertive. Sometimes it felt like he was trying to prove something to himself, not to me. With each passing day, it became harder to be near him. Our connection had been built on forbidden desire, but now that desire had dissolved, leaving only the consequences. I thought back to the days when Jason and I first started living together. Simple but happy moments, when nothing needed explaining, when everything felt so easy. Now I sat alone in an empty apartment, feeling like I had destroyed everything good I once had. That night I lay in bed, but sleep wouldn't come. I stared at the ceiling for hours, realizing that I was left alone with the consequences of my choices. Colin was nearby, but his presence no longer comforted me. It weighed on me, a constant reminder of what I had lost. I felt like a stranger in my life, in my body, in my home. The divorce was inevitable, like rain at the end of a long storm. The official papers were signed, and Jason was gone from my life for good. I thought I'd feel relief, but instead, I was left with emptiness. I stared at my hands holding the final documents, unable to shake the feeling that my life was slipping away to a place where I no longer had control over it. Colin remained by my side, but his presence no longer comforted me. He was no longer just my stepson, and yet he hadn't become someone I could call a partner. Everything that had happened between us felt like a forbidden memory, bringing more pain than joy. Our relationship grew increasingly strained. Colin tried to support me, but his words now felt hollow. He didn't understand the storm of guilt, doubt, and inner turmoil raging inside me. "Do you think I should leave?" he asked one day, his voice serious but without anger. I couldn't answer right away. "I don't know," I said honestly. Those words felt like an admission that I could no longer live in this house in this state with him near me. Every morning was the same. I woke up feeling weighed down. I no longer wanted to be with Colin, but I didn't know how to rebuild my life. My inner world was in crisis, and the only thing I understood was that I needed to change something. One evening, as I stared out the window, I realized I no longer wanted to live to meet anyone else's expectations. I needed to learn to live for myself. I decided it was time to start fresh. The next day, I began looking for a job. It was difficult, but I felt a strange sense of freedom. I returned to my skills, to what I had loved doing before the marriage. Gradually, I started meeting new people. At first, it was terrifying, but every conversation, every interaction gave me a little more strength. Colin stayed in my life, but he became a part of my past, not my future. I could no longer see him as someone I wanted to be with. Our mistakes had changed us both, but they hadn't brought us closer. A few months later, I moved into a new home. It was a small house, but it became a symbol of my new beginning. There, I felt free, even if loneliness occasionally crept in. I looked in the mirror and saw a woman who had been through a lot. My past no longer defined me. I knew the road ahead would be hard, but I was finally ready to move forward. I let go of Colin. I let go of Jason. I let go of everything that tied me to the past. Now I was learning to live again, growing stronger with each passing day.